Thank you, Mary. In 1989, I was a 29-year-old Washington bureau chief of one, me, living large on $33,000 a year and working as a political correspondent for the Arkansas Gazette. Now, around my neck, I had credentials draped like Barbara Bush pearls. So I had easy access to the US Capitol, the Supreme Court, congressional offices, even the Pentagon. And if you'd been there, you would have seen me walking through the halls of the US Capitol with my notebook and my pen in the air as I squeezed past tourists. And you would have also heard the clacking sound of my red snakeskin high heel shoes as I crossed those marble stairs. Now, one day, out of the blue, I got a call from David Holwork, the editorial page editor of an acclaimed newspaper in Lexington, Kentucky. Straight away, he asked me, "Have you ever thought about being an editorial writer?" And in my head, I went, "Ooh, no way." But to him, I was a little bit more polite, and I said, "No, tell me more. Why do you ask?" He said some friends of mine had recommended me for a job opening on his editorial page. And so he'd read some of my work, and we decided we'd talk for a little while about it. And the next thing you know, I decided I'd go to Kentucky for the interview. But I couldn't imagine leaving my big life in Washington for a little editorial board in Kentucky. When I got to Kentucky for the interview, that little editorial board proved me wrong in every way, because I had thought, editorial writing is for old people at least 40. And those people scratched their chins and thought brilliant thoughts about Gorbachev. And they stayed in glass offices all day long, and they had mountains of opinions that they could draft policy solutions. I wasn't qualified, I didn't have enough experience, and I didn't even have an opinion about my favorite color. But there I was in Kentucky, and that little editorial board turned out to be scrappy and brash. That little editorial board, in fact, had 4 Pulitzer finalists in 5 years. The editorial cartoonist liked to draw the governor as a weasel. David Holwork, he ran for student body president at the University of Kentucky in the 1960s, wearing a blue chenille toilet seat cover on his head as a beret. And in Lexington in those days, he was writing country music lyrics, and those featured dumb criminals in the news. It was a crusading newspaper, and at its helm was John Carroll, who was one of the best editors of his generation and a maestro of Pulitzer work, a Nieman Fellow. He was my friend until his death last year. I liked these people, and I liked the way they spoke truth to power, and so it didn't make any sense on paper, but I trusted my gut and left Washington for the Lexington Herald-Leader. Now, 7 months after I got there, months when I was trying to learn how to be an editorial writer, a woman named Jeannie Purcell was taken hostage by her estranged, abusive husband. The hostage crisis lasted 17 hours, and at the end of it, she was dead, shot by her husband, and he had killed himself. Now, we on the editorial board slept through most of the story while the news reporters did their job. And it was my task the next day to write one editorial that answered the question, had the system failed Jeannie Purcell? I made some calls. I even wrote a few paragraphs in my computer, and I never finished that editorial because I knew quickly that it was a bigger story. Wife beating was pervasive in Kentucky. I learned from the people I talked to that Kentucky had good laws, but not good enough, and the laws that were on the books were not enforced uniformly by police, prosecutors, and judges. So women in Kentucky were being victimized twice, once at home, once by the system. So I did what any good editorial writer would do. I went to John Carroll, and David Holwork and made my plea, please put the investigative reporting team on this story. And John didn't hesitate and said, no, you keep it. And Holwork said, find out what's out there. So for months I made calls and traveled across Kentucky, asking for court documents and transcripts that people in the courts didn't want to give me. Women told me their stories. I confronted prosecutors and judges about their practices, and I must admit there were many days I cried because I didn't think I was up to the task. I would tell John that in his office because I was having nightmares about beatings and rapes. And I lay awake at night wondering, if I put these women's names in the paper, are they going to be in further danger? The only way I got through it was through the help of these colleagues and editors and my need to give women their say. So in December 1990, we published the first editorial of a form that others have called an investigative editorial. It was titled, A Death Foretold, and this is how it begins. Betty Jean Ashby's life was in danger. She knew it. Her family knew it. Her neighbors in Louisville's Shepherd Square housing project knew it. Louisville police knew it. The Jefferson County courts knew it too. Had the threat come from a mugger, rapist, or hold-up man, the authorities might have seen their duty more clearly. But this was what the law called a domestic case. The man who was stalking Betty Ashby was Carl Branch, her common-law husband, the father of her 4 children. The trouble between Betty and Carl was bad and growing worse. Carl had beaten her twice within 2 months. He had developed the chilling habit of cleaning his gun in her presence. In fear, Betty Ashby turned to the law. She went through all the steps. She appeared in court, signed sworn documents, told her story to the police, but nothing, it seemed, could keep Carl away. When Carl showed up at her apartment on February 10th, 1989, the only protection she had was a sofa propped against the door and a pot of scalding hot water on the stove. Betty climbed out a window, clad only in a shirt, and ran for her life. Carl, wielding an orange crowbar, pursued her across the street. He cornered her in the bedroom of a neighbor's apartment, and the neighbor, Marva Anderson, could only hug her 4-year-old daughter and cry, Lord Jesus, as Carl hit Betty in the head again and again until she sank to the floor, dead at age 22. The editorial went on to describe how Betty Jean Ashby sought help many times, but the police didn't arrest Carl. And when she was running for her life, the police dispatcher put out a call that said, be on the lookout for a man chasing a woman with a crowbar. And the dispatcher labeled it Priority 3, which is the same priority given loud music playing in the backyard or a motorcycle being revved up. Betty Jean Ashby's case was not an isolated one. Across Kentucky, women told me how their cases had been minimized and their fears ignored. There was the case of a woman left lying unconscious in her front yard after her husband beat her, with their child as a witness, who said, Daddy, why did you hit Mama and kill her? She wasn't dead, but she had a broken jaw, and the husband's penalty was $57.50 in court costs. In another county, a man repeatedly beat his wife, once for being unable to find his socks. The judge in that county offered his own solution. He sent the two to church together. Over the course of about a year, we published 30 editorials in the series To Have and to Harm, making recommendations for improved response and protections for battered women in Kentucky. And to our utter delight, in 1992, every piece of domestic violence legislation reform we'd recommended passed, and the courts changed their practices too. I learned the power of editorials, and I learned we don't get this done alone. The women who let me tell their stories and show their faces and print their names did. The people who read the newspaper and made calls to lawmakers did. You know, all these years later, at a time of such discouragement and disenchantment over our public life, I look back and remember the power of the press and ordinary citizens to effect change. Both of them out of a love of community and a passion for fairness. And all these years later, I have not given up on what is possible. Thank you.